Ellie Goldratt said, "Productivity is meaningless unless you know the goal." I'm Ray Myers. Welcome to Craft vs. Cruft. And we got a quick one today. This is about goal trees. Now, if you've seen my previous videos on theory of constraints, you know that my favorite thinking process in theory of constraints is called the evaporating cloud or conflict resolution diagram. But of late, goal trees are becoming a close runner-up, and I'll show you why. Because it's kind of deceptively simple what they do, and yet this is something that it turns out you will find a lot of situations where it hasn't actually been done, and so this is really helpful to introduce. Now, this was reformulated from one of the theory of constraints novels by Bill Dettmer. He originally had a book simply called Goldratt's Theory of Constraints, which he rewrote into logical thinking process. See, Ellie Goldratt wrote business novels. He didn't write textbooks. So Dettmer came along and gathered this and formulated it into one sort of self-consistent system in more textbook format. As you can see, we have the original version here, which is called Goldratt's Theory of Constraints, A Systems Approach to Continuous Improvement by Bill Dettmer, and it was rewritten into the green book on the left, The Logical Thinking Process, A Systems Approach to Complex Problem Solving. On the right, you also see Strategic Navigation, which is another book of his, A Systems Approach to Business Strategy, and it is the application book for the textbook of the logical thinking process. So they're kind of two sides of the same coin. I want to read the second. I have not yet, but I'm told that is the relationship between them. The Strategic Navigation is the application book for the theory in LTP. Now, the elements of logical thinking process are as follows, right? These are various thinking processes that have been kind of distilled from theory of constraints. If you're doing LTP, you would start here in the center with the goal tree, which we're going to talk about in a second. And if you are having trouble meeting one of these necessary conditions leading to the goal, then you would proceed upward to the current reality tree and then basically go clockwise around the circle and around the circle. These answer different questions. As you can see here, what do we actually want to achieve is in the goal tree. What might we want to change is the current reality tree or problem tree, which is kind of like a root cause analysis. And the rest are going to cover things like what do we want to change to and how do we implement that change successfully. Now, this isn't the only way you might use the different theory of constraints thinking processes in relation to each other. There's also something called the three-cloud method, and if you saw my episode interviewing Carl Perry, he has a method that is focused almost entirely around the just evaporating cloud, just number 3 on the right here. So in logical thinking process, this is how they are used together, but it is not the only way they can be used. Now, what actually is a goal tree? The one in the center that you start with. It is a tree of nodes, which if you've done data structures, you know what that refers to. It is simply a goal node at the top, at the root, with a hierarchy of necessary conditions leading up to it. So the nodes are labeled typically in 3 ways: G for goal, NC for a necessary condition, and some of the necessary conditions are actually labeled as CSF, critical success factors. Now, those are just like big necessary conditions. It's just a difference in the level of abstraction that they're at. There's really no objective difference between a CSF and an NC in my understanding. If you're in a bigger context where you might have an organization and departments within it and teams within it and so on, then you might want to actually nest these within each other. And that's possible to do with something called an intermediate objective map. And that is simply a goal tree in which one of the necessary conditions becomes the goal of a subtree. So it's just a matter of going up and down the levels of abstraction, and they can interrelate in that way. So, how do we make one of these? Well, you can see these are just from the Logical Thinking Process book in Chapter 3. I highly recommend that if you'd like to get into the nitty-gritty here. You see here the steps Dettmer recommends, right? 1, define the system. What is in the system? What is outside of it? What is the single outcome we want to achieve? And you'd be surprised how often this has not been defined. So very helpful exercise in and of itself. Oftentimes people have hidden assumptions about what they think the goal is. And until they're actually comparing notes in an exercise like this or some other, they don't realize they didn't have the same thing in their mind. So you achieve consensus on the system goal, and then you just sort of carry out this recursive process of identifying necessary conditions for the top level goal, and those are typically the critical success factors, and then look at each of those and identify 3 to 5 nodes that should go below that. But I want to emphasize there's a particular criteria here. This is not just a list of stuff you want or a tree of stuff you want, or stuff that might be nice to have. They are necessary conditions, literally, and you are attempting to identify all of the necessary conditions. So I want to drive this home. A really crucial part of Goal Tree as an exercise is that you are identifying and representing only things that are required in order to meet the goal. And you are trying to be exhaustive in how you're identifying them. So if all the necessary conditions were met, they are also sufficient. If any of the things were not met, then the goal cannot be met. And so obviously drawing those boxes and arrows doesn't guarantee that you've done that correctly, but that is the representation you are attempting to make. And many planning processes do not have that property. So going back to the list, on step 6, we're connecting them. And in step 7, we're verifying that logic. We're making sure that every arrow really does represent our understanding of the causal relationships at play. Now, a really common form of hierarchical objective planning is OKRs, which stands for Objective Key Results. You might wonder, aren't these just OKRs, these goal trees I'm suggesting? Well, there are people that say a lot of good things about OKRs. OKRs might be great. I've never actually experienced OKRs, despite the fact that most of the places I've worked have done something by that name. It has always been said, oh, we're not actually doing real OKRs. So I don't actually know what it's like to really do them. I don't mean to criticize its actual implementation. I've probably never seen it done right. But they're not always equivalent to logical thinking process goal trees. I think it'd be interesting to figure out if they even could overlap. It's probably the case that you could have an OKR tree that was a valid logical thinking process goal tree. But there are things that make them typically different, right? One is that goal tree arrows between those boxes, they represent a relationship of logical necessity. That's generally not what OKRs represent. They represent the things we've decided to do in support of doing something. It's not necessarily a matter of logical necessity. Another difference, and this may be just how they're commonly implemented rather than what the official OKRs need to be, but OKRs are often attached to quarterly and annual planning and reward cycles. This tends to incentivize performative adherence to your part of the plan, not the success of the overall system. Now, that's just me editorializing based on my own experience. You might say that OKRs can be implemented in a way that doesn't do that. I'm glad to hear it. Finally, goal trees are a dynamic part of the strategic navigation process I mentioned, right? That big wheel. So when you have a problem meeting one of the necessary conditions, you have this rigorous process you can go through to address that situation. So there's the rest of the freaking owl here. Anyway, I'll link some resources. I have found it to be a really enlightening exercise when I come into a situation where, especially if I'm sensing some ambiguity about what needs to get done, to do kind of a goal tree workshop and come up with what our representation collectively is of the situation. It helps communicate, within a team, across teams. I know this is all abstract. We didn't look at an example. I would like to do an example in a future episode, and this is kind of groundwork, but I do recommend, if you're at all interested, looking at some of Dettmer's work or Goldrat's work on these areas. When I've made these, I've also gotten some pretty rich feedback from the Theory of Constraints community. So if you have some expertise in this and there's anything that I didn't quite say in the way that you would have, I do welcome that perspective. Stay tuned to the comments for any of that. As Lao Tzu said in the Tao Te Ching, with patience, the most tangled cord may be undone. Thank you.